Michigan's Governor George Romney makes it official, announcing his candidacy for the Republican presidential nomination.
I have decided to fight for and win the Republican nomination and election.
In 1968, the LDS Church faced a choice between two futures. One was represented by George Romney, moderate, civil rights-focused, and independent. The other was a radical fusion of scripture and anti-communist paranoia led by Ezra Taft Benson. We know who won. But today, for the first time in 60 years, that victory is being interrogated by the numbers. Latter-day Saints are the most reliable Republican voting bloc in America, more loyal than evangelicals, more predictable than any faith group in the country. 75% identify as Republican. Utah hasn't voted for a Democrat since 1964. But here's what the numbers don't tell you. This wasn't inevitable. It wasn't natural. And the data coming out in 2025 and 2026 suggests the whole arrangement might be falling apart. This is the story of 3 reasons why millions of Mormons became Republicans, and why the deal they made 60 years ago may finally be reaching its expiration date. Part 1. Reason 1. They turned politics into theology. To understand how Mormons became Republicans, you have to understand one man, Ezra Taft Benson. Benson was an apostle in the Quorum of the 12. He had served 8 years as Secretary of Agriculture under Eisenhower, and by the early 1960s, he had one obsession: communism. Not communism as a political system, communism as a spiritual enemy. Benson was deeply connected to the John Birch Society, the most extreme anti-communist organization in America at the time. His son Reed became its Utah state coordinator. Benson used LDS meeting houses for Birch Society meetings. He spoke at their rallies. He quoted directly from the Birch Society's founding document in church talks without crediting the source. When scholars later analyzed one of his major speeches, they found 24% of it was copied word for word from the John Birch Society's Blue Book. But Benson didn't just promote anti-communism, he fused it with Mormon doctrine. In his framework, communism wasn't just a bad idea, it was Satan's plan. The welfare state was a step toward slavery. The United Nations was a front group. And if you disagreed, if you were a moderate, a Democrat, or even just uncertain, you weren't simply wrong. You were spiritually compromised. This is the move that changed everything. Because once politics becomes theology, there's no room for debate. You don't argue with doctrine, you obey it. Benson didn't just give Mormons a political party, he gave them a moral map where the exit ramps were labeled as apostasy. He effectively removed the middle ground from the pews. Not everyone agreed. The first presidency pushed back hard. In January 1963, they issued a public statement denouncing members of the John Birch Society who tried to align the church or its leadership with their political views. 3 days later, Benson spoke at a Birch Society rally anyway. Newspapers called it an open act of defiance against his own leadership. Even deeply conservative apostles like Joseph Fielding Smith and Harold B. Lee thought Benson had gone too far. The church eventually reassigned him to a mission in Europe, widely understood as an exile to get him out of American politics. But here's what the leadership underestimated. You can exile a man. You can't exile an idea that's already taken root. By the time Benson came back, thousands of Latter-day Saints had internalized his message. The merger between Republican politics and righteous living was already set. And there was another path. George Romney, father of Mitt, was the opposite model. Governor of Michigan, a serious presidential contender, and a man who marched for civil rights. Romney represented a conservatism built on pragmatism, compassion, and political independence. He believed the church's strength was in being a swing vote, leveraging both parties, beholden to neither. Romney's presidential campaign collapsed in 1968. Benson's vision survived, and what happened next, the second reason, is something that still controls how millions of Mormons vote today. Stay with me. Part 2, Reason 2, the family became a fortress. The late 1960s brought a revolution that hit the LDS Church harder than almost any institution in America. The birth control pill, the feminist movement, the sexual revolution, the hippie counterculture, drug culture on college campuses. For most Americans, these were social changes, disruptive, maybe uncomfortable, but part of an evolving society. For Latter-day Saints, They were an existential threat because the Mormon Church doesn't just value the family. The family is the entire point. In LDS theology, the family unit isn't temporary, it's eternal. Marriage isn't until death do you part. It's forever, sealed in temples, extending into the afterlife. The husband provides, the wife nurtures. The children are the purpose of existence itself. Every role is defined, every expectation is clear. Now imagine what the 1960s looked like from inside that worldview. Women demanding careers instead of motherhood, young people rejecting marriage, sexual liberation, divorce rates climbing, gender roles being questioned for the first time in American history. This wasn't just cultural change. For devout Latter-day Saints, it felt like the foundations of eternity were being attacked, and there was only one political party promising to fight back. The Republican Party positioned itself as the defender of traditional family values, the party of moral order, the party that would hold the line against everything the 60s had unleashed. For Mormon families, especially in Utah, Idaho, and Arizona, this wasn't a political calculation. It was survival. Voting Republican became an act of protecting everything sacred. The church reinforced this in 1995 with The Family, A Proclamation to the World, a document that defined marriage as between a man and a woman, established gender roles as divinely ordained, and essentially codified the 1960s backlash into official doctrine. By then, the fusion was complete. You couldn't separate Mormon family identity from Republican political identity. They were the same thing. But here's the part nobody talks about. When you build a fortress, you also build a prison. This created a culture of enforced consensus. When your eternal family, your social circle, and your professional network are all tied to the same identity. A Democratic yard sign isn't a political statement. It's a social suicide note. A former Arizona state president described how, in 2016, when he considered putting up a sign opposing Trump, he knew it would make his church calling impossible. His own wife warned him. He waited 4 years before going public. In the Mountain West, the GOP didn't just win the vote, they won the neighborhood. Part 3. Reason 3. Fear became the default setting. The third reason is the one that sealed everything in place, and it has a date, 1968. April, King is dead. June, Kennedy is dead. August, Chicago is screaming. Anti-Vietnam War protests paralyzed universities. The National Guard deployed against American citizens. The Democratic National Convention turned into a street battle broadcast live on national television. For a people who believe God is not the author of confusion, 1968 didn't just look like a bad year. It looked like the end of the world. For Latter-day Saints, a community that prizes order, obedience, hierarchy, and institutional stability above almost everything, this was a nightmare made real. It didn't matter that the causes behind the protests were legitimate. What mattered was the feeling, the overwhelming, visceral sense that the country was falling apart. And at that exact moment, Richard Nixon stepped forward with 2 words that would define Mormon political behavior for the next 6 decades: law and order. Nixon didn't sell a platform, he sold a sedative. And Mormons have been taking that sedative for half a century. Utah voted for Nixon, and it has never voted for a Democratic presidential candidate since. Not once. Not in over 60 years. That fear response became permanent. It didn't stay frozen in 1968. It evolved. In the 1980s, the external threat was the Soviet Union. In the 2000s, it was terrorism. In the 2010s, it was immigration and the collapse of traditional social norms. The specific enemy changed every decade, but the mechanism stayed identical. There is a threat outside, and only one party can protect you from it. Benson understood this instinctively. Cleon Skousen, another prominent Mormon and Birch Society figure, built an entire intellectual framework around it. Their legacy wasn't a set of policies, it was a reflex, a deep, automatic association between safety and the Republican Party that became so embedded in Mormon culture, it felt like common sense rather than a choice. And for 60 years, the machine ran perfectly, until it didn't. Part 4. The deal is cracking. Here is what the data says in 2025 and 2026, and nobody in Salt Lake City wants to talk about it. A massive analysis of the Cooperative Election Study, covering nearly 2 decades and thousands of Latter-day Saint respondents, found that Mormons are the only major religious group in America that has shifted toward the Democratic Party. Every other faith group moved right. Mormons moved left. The Republican advantage among LDS members shrank from a 51-point gap to 33 points in less than 20 years. Among young Latter-day Saints under 35, the numbers are even more striking. Only about 40% identify as Republican, 35% identify as Democrat, 25% call themselves independent. A majority still voted for Trump in 2024, but the generational trend is unmistakable. In 2016, when Trump first ran, he got only 52% of the Mormon vote. For a community that gave Mitt Romney 84% just 4 years earlier, that was a collapse. A Mormon independent named Evan McMullen actually outpolled Hillary Clinton among LDS voters in Utah. Trump recovered in 2020 and 2024, hovering around 64% nationally. But the rest of conservative America surged further right in the same period. Mormons moved the opposite direction. The reason is painfully ironic. The 3 things that fused Mormons to the GOP, theological certainty, family values identity, and the instinct for order, are the exact things that make Trump-era republicanism uncomfortable for many Latter-day Saints. Data scientist Alex Bass, who runs the Mormon Metrics Project, put it plainly: committed Mormons didn't change their policy views. But Trump-era republicanism conflicted with distinctly LDS cultural values around civility and institutional trust. The party changed. The deal didn't account for that. And underneath the political shift, something even more fundamental is happening. The data reveals a paradox. The very family values that built the fortress are now driving the youth away. Because for Gen Z, those values aren't found in 1950s nostalgia, but in issues the current GOP has abandoned. General Social Survey data shows that LDS retention of childhood members dropped from over 75% in the 1970s and 1980s to roughly 40% in the 2020s. Those who leave tend to be younger, more educated, and more politically moderate. The church is losing the battle for the next generation's political soul because the 1968 reflex no longer works on someone born in 2005. 3 reasons turned Latter-day Saints into Republicans: an apostle who made politics into theology, a cultural revolution that turned the family into a political fortress, and a year of chaos that hardwired fear into an entire community's voting behavior. For 60 years, those 3 forces created the most reliable religious voting machine in American history. But every machine has a lifespan. The generation that lived through 1968 is aging out. Their grandchildren are asking questions that the machine was specifically designed to prevent. And the party that Mormons married in the 60s has become something that many of them no longer recognize. The deal of 1968 was simple: stability in exchange for loyalty. But as the party changes and the world shifts, Latter-day Saints are realizing that stability was an illusion, and the price of loyalty is becoming too high to pay. The detour is ending. The question is, what's left of the road? If this is your first time hearing the real history behind Mormon politics, you're not alone. The church doesn't teach this in Sunday school. Subscribe and hit the bell, because the next video goes deeper into the financial empire that makes all of this possible. And that story is even harder to believe.